I don't know if Des is the Knight. No matter whether she is or not, however, I believe that the Knight's conspiracy is being undertaken to find her, return her to her original form, or in some other way reunite her with her friends, family, and lover. Evidence for that spans the textual, the subtextual, and the metatextual, but purely off of intuition. Asgore seems involved in a quest to solve a mystery, a quest which appears to intersect with Dark Worlds and have consumed him in more ways than one. He has a conspiracy corkboard in his room which matches one in Carol and Rudy's room, implying that the conspiracy Asgore is involved in involves the holidays. A reasonable candidate for the source of that conspiracy is thus the disappearance of Des, an event which appears to still linger over Deltarune's world, Des herself haunting the narrative, perhaps literally. The fact that the holidays, or at the very least Carol, seems too to be involved in the Knight's conspiracy, another quest intersecting with Dark Worlds and consuming its participants, implies that the Knight's conspiracy is an extension of the search for Des. That motivation also serves to explain why and how the conspiracy got started, and why and how it intersects with this alternate dimension. This narrative can be modified to accommodate Des Knight theories, such as by suggesting that Des is feral, corrupted, or otherwise not whole, and by imagining that the end goal of the conspiracy is to purify her. But, for the sake of this particular video, treat it as fact that the Knight conspiracy and the Des conspiracy are one and the same. Assuming that, these are the questions that I now have to ask. If that is true, what else should, could, or must be true? The narrative I've just proposed doesn't address a few of Deltarune's core themes or plot elements, most notably, the prophecy. The story I have laid bare can be told without the prophecy, and the fact that the prophecy nonetheless is such a major element of the game makes my conclusion suspect. The theses you are about to hear are a culmination of my ruminations on the prophecy, originally designed for a different video, but which I'm now packaging into this one. What I've landed on is that there are two sets of heroes, the Fun Gang, and who I'm choosing to call the Lightbringers, heroes handpicked by Carol and the Knight to execute on the prophecy. Chris is the first hero of both groups, their loyalties torn, and their dilemma absolutely harrowing. The other two Lightbringers, being intentionally maneuvered into the roles of second and third hero, are Noelle and Azrael, reflections of Susie and Rousey. I suspect that in Deltarune's climax, we will see the Fun Gang down a member as Chris, in a moment of weakness, their guilt too overwhelming, their trauma too oppressive, their sense of responsibility too inescapable, switches sides to join with the Lightbringers. The resulting battle will be the Lightbringers versus the Fun Gang, who will now be joined by us, the Vessel. The theory will be structured as follows. I will begin with an exploration of the opening Gonnermaker sequence and the significance I believe it holds. I will then, sequentially, analyze each of the three heroes and explain who was handpicked for each role and why. I'll end with a hypothetical exploration of future chapters were Lightbringer theory to be true. With that out of the way, onwards and upwards. In the opening Gonnermaker sequence, Gaster guides you through creating a vessel, implied to be a physical form for your soul to inhabit. At the end of this sequence, Gaster is interrupted by who is presumed to be a second person, who rejects the notion of free will. The voice begins to speak. Your name is... Before the scene cuts away to Toriel finishing the sentence with Chris. It's not long before we realize that our soul, intended for the vessel, has ended up in Chris Dreamer instead. The implication here is that this second voice stole the soul away from Gaster and placed it into Chris's body. This becomes relevant to the prophecy when you consider how closely linked Gaster is to that prophecy. Whether or not he wrote it is a question that seems impossible to answer. There's too much evidence supporting too many different conclusions. Those who believe he did write the prophecy point to the prophecy being quoted in Wingdings on Deltarune's website before the game launched, point to Gaster being quoted in the church hymn, point to mentions of Heaven's Call, tying back to Gaster being the apparent god of this world, and thus the progenitor of the prophecy that's worshipped like a god. Those who believe he didn't, and is in fact trying to subvert the prophecy, point to the frequent hell imagery associated with Gaster, including the number 666, and how the Shadow Crystal bosses, who have direct ties to Gaster, don't appear to be prophesized. There's a compromise which will serve as my assumption for the remainder of this theory. It's possible Gaster is serving both as God and Satan, heaven and hell. He didn't just create this world, he penned the story we are now characters in, as well as all other characters, locations, and set pieces. He is more analogous to Toby Fox than anyone else. He could have written the prophecy as an in-universe obstacle to overcome. the second voice that defies him and steals the soul from him. It's possible that this was not a subversion of Gaster's design, but rather, yet another part of the story he has written. This is supported by how, in future appearances, he seems supportive of the soul being in Chris, still speaking as if the experiment is going according to plan, which would be counterintuitive if he had been usurped. And just from a suspension of disbelief standpoint, the fact that inputting certain characters' names gets Gaster to comment on their upcoming significance implies that he knows how the plot is going to play out. Susie, Noelle, and other hometown characters would presumably not be relevant to his grand design if the soul wasn't intended for Chris all along. This isn't an interruption. This was a part of the plan. But why deliberately toy with us then? Be so cruel as to get our hopes up only to snatch them away from us? I believe it is to set up the themes of the narrative right at the onset, free will versus predestination, and given that the narrative is contriving to have your choices don't matter be constantly challenged and disproved, it seems to me that the ultimate theme of Gaster's story will be that they do, and that the hero's journey will be proving that they do. He ran through this sequence with you to present what you could have, and then had a villain strip it away from you to motivate you to disprove the notion this villain is expressing. Therefore, when Gaster is cheering for you in future chapters, he is cheering for you to defy fate, defy destiny. And what is it that, in Deltarune, is fate and destiny personified? The prophecy. If Gaster wrote the prophecy, then he wrote it to be defied. Gaster calls Deltarune his Deltarune. This is his story, and it's a story about defying fate. If my previous theories about Gaster are correct, perhaps this is something that means so much to him, because he once befell a terrible fate of his own. Consider even the word Deltarune. Delta is the Greek symbol used to represent mathematical change, something the scientist Gaster would be well aware of. A rune is a symbol of mystical significance, often associated with prophecies and legends. DELTARUNE. Change the prophecy. Gaster is supportive of you defeating the knight, who appears to be executing on the prophecy, given how their making of the Dark Fountains is mentioned in that prophecy. He re-emerges to comment on how beautifully the story is playing out. After Chapter 4, right when you're at your most motivated to defy fate, defy the knight, right when Chris seems ready to choose their friends over the knight's conspiracy. So that means that in Gaster's narrative, the knight, and presumably those associated with the knight, such as the other agents of the conspiracy, occupy a villainous role. It seems obvious. They're the villains of the game, but I say it to cement that they're also villains from Gaster's perspective. The person at the beginning, the villain who Gaster had interrupt him to declare that choices don't matter, this is presumably somebody affiliated with the knight's conspiracy. Perhaps it's the knight themselves. Japanese grammar analysis suggests that this person talks like a darkener, and the knight is trapped in perpetual darkness. If you're a Death Knight believer, this second speaker also uses a style of grammar previously used by Kara, and due to Kara being a lost sibling whose death kicked off the plot and who now haunts the narrative, Des and Kara can be argued to be metatextual analogs. Follow this to its logical conclusion. The knight and their clan are representative of the idea that choices don't matter. The prophecy is also representative of the idea that choices don't matter. Both are villainous presences in the game. Therefore, it stands to reason that the knight and their clan are seeking to execute on the prophecy, bring it to fruition. Therefore, when this second voice steals the soul and puts it into Chris, they're likely doing it to further a plan that involves fulfilling the prophecy. This is supported by their dismissal of the idea of choices mattering, something that wouldn't make sense if this soul was put into Chris for the purpose of defying the prophecy. The first hero in the prophecy is described as a cage with human soul and parts. Carol, supposed mastermind of the knight's conspiracy, is aware of the human soul if you believe she's the voice on the phone. And even if you don't, the line, "You are welcome here anytime," still implies that the soul was given to Chris for a reason related to their and Carol's grander plan. I assert that, given that the knight and their clan are trying to execute on the prophecy, this soul was summoned and put into Chris to intentionally make Chris the first hero. Whatever they desire at the end of the prophecy, they need heroes, and Chris was the only candidate at arm's length who could comfortably house a human soul.
Hi, Editing Trenton here. I am just realizing that what I said made absolutely zero sense. See, Chris is a human. Chris presumably already had a soul, so Carol and the Knight wouldn't have needed to do anything, summon anything, in order for them to fit the criteria required by the role of the first hero. But then again, this soul presumably has special properties. There wouldn't have been a need to summon it if it didn't. Perhaps only red souls or like humans from another world possess souls can close dark fountains, because Carol seems to be under the assumption, or whoever is on the phone, seems to be under the assumption that this soul is integral for whatever Chris is doing in the dark world, and the soul is what allows them to close the dark fountains. So it could just, and this is an assertion you can make no matter what theory about the conspiracy you believe, that this soul was summoned to intentionally allow Chris to carry out the prophecy, but not because it's a human soul, but because it's special in some way. I don't know. All I'm asking is, don't let this disprove the entire rest of the theory that I'm really, really proud of, and forgive me, please?
Hints how and why Chris got involved in this whole mess. But wait, that doesn't make any sense. If Chris was intentionally made the first hero, then the logical conclusion would be that the second and third heroes were also chosen intentionally by the Knight's clan. After all, if they're going to execute on the prophecy, then they need 3 heroes to do it. But the second and the third heroes are Susie and Ralsei, and Carol hates Susie. She demands Susie leave her house and never come back, stop associating with her daughter. Whoever is speaking on the phone further declares that Susie must be kept out of their plans. And there's no evidence of any connection between Ralsei and the Knight's conspiracy. In fact, there's plenty of evidence to the contrary. Besides, both Susie and Ralsei embody the hope that the prophecy can be defied, so them being retained as agents to help bring the prophecy to fruition hardly makes any sense. But the Knight's clan still has to have set up a second and third hero, right? But if they can't have put Susie and Ralsei in those roles, then there's another second and third hero out there. The Knight's preferred second and third hero, the Lightbringers. The choice for the alternate second hero is obvious. It's Noelle Holiday. Discourse surrounding the second hero has been circular since the release of chapters 3 and 4. I will not rehash what many in the audience likely already know beyond this very basic summary. The panel describing the second hero, the girl with hope crossed on her heart, is emphasized in Chapter 4 to a suspicious extent for something that's supposedly a settled fact. The chapters deliberately drawing attention to the second hero, inviting us to ask questions to dig deeper. And people have asked whether this panel rightfully or exclusively depicts Susie. The main sticking point is that Susie cannot wield blades. There are other textual and thematic indications that she may not be the prophesied second hero, such as another panel describing a different girl, potentially depicting Susie more authoritatively. Furthermore, Susie is a manifestation of the desire to defy fate to a greater extent than Chris or Ralsei, so it would be fitting if her stubborn want to carve her own path in life led her to claim a role not meant for her by sheer force of will. The main alternate candidate would be Noelle, who can equip certain blades. A second panel reading, "Love finds its way to the girl," is additionally more applicable to Noelle than Susie, as love can have the double meaning of romance in the normal route, and a level of violence in the weird route. However, anybody claiming that this is Noelle has to contend with this prophecy panel, which appears to definitively show Susie, down to the height and hair shape. Most people assume that between Susie and Noelle, one must be the prophesized hero of the prophecy, that the hero can only have one identity, and that the prophecy has somebody specific in mind. I've landed on a different interpretation. I think that this prophecy can be fulfilled as long as anybody matching the criteria comes along. This could still be in line with a thematically rich idea that Susie willed her way into being a hero. Perhaps it's even more powerful this way. It wasn't just that some abstract notion of fate never intended for Susie to be a hero. A very real, very concrete, very powerful conspiracy deliberately sought to prevent her from becoming one. And yet, here she is. Both Susie and Noelle have the potential to be the second hero if they end up in the right place at the right time. Noelle ending up in the right place at the right time is something that the Knight and Carol seem to be trying to guarantee. The game has provided no answers as to why the Knight is opening dark fountains, except to suggest that they're not doing it to cause the roaring. If that was their ultimate goal, they could trigger it happening at any time, and presumably would have done it already. No, the knight is intentionally opening these fountains as means to an end. What is that end? To answer that, we first must ask why the knight is opening the fountains in the places that they are. The school closet, the computer lab, and the church. These locations are being chosen intentionally. They're too random and too risky of choices if the knight just wanted to open fountains for the sake of opening fountains. But they all have one thing in common. These are places that Noelle is likely to be. Noelle is an honors student at that school who may make frequent trips to the closet to retrieve supplies for her teachers, something she even volunteered to do in Chapter 1 before Alphys gave the tasks to Susie and Chris. In Chapter 2, Noelle is studying in the computer lab when the Dark World is opened. In Chapter 4, Noelle, a member of the choir, was due at the church for choir practice when the fountain was opened. The implication here is that the knight, and presumably the others involved with the knight's conspiracy, are trying to engineer a situation where Noelle could end up in the Dark World, and if the conspiracy very intentionally summoned the soul for Chris so that they could be the first hero, a plausible reason why they would want Noelle to be in the Dark World is so that she could become the second hero. Almost every single theory regarding the conspiracy concludes that Carol, or another member of the Holiday family, is intimately involved, meaning that Noelle's schedule and habits would be common knowledge to the knight. Look now at how Queen acts when Noelle is successfully brought into the Dark World. She is very possessive over Noelle, fawning over Noelle's strength, seeking to use her to achieve some ultimate goal. This could reflect how Noelle is seen by the agents of the conspiracy, being a pawn in their game, integral to their plot, but little more. The notion that Noelle is being intentionally placed into the role of the second hero also explains an odd deviation from the plot that happens in the Weird Route. At the end of the Weird Route, in Chapter 4, Chris gets a phone call from Carol, seeking to confirm that Chris will be taking Noelle to the festival. Meanwhile, in the normal route, the phone call is more ominous, reminding Chris sternly about a promise they made. If Carol is on the other end of the line in the normal route as well, then the dichotomy in how she acts is intriguing. In the normal route, Carol seems to believe Chris is in danger of violating the terms of their agreement. Rightfully, I may add. No such trepidation in the Weird Route. She's a lot calmer and more professional. Noelle going with Chris instead of Susie to the festival seems to be Carol's preferred outcome, given her hostility towards Susie, something which is only achieved in the Weird Route. One conclusion that can be drawn from this is that the Weird Route is all according to Carol's plan. I won't speculate as to how much Carol knows about, or has accounted for, the horrific abuse the Weird Route is inflicting on her daughter. But some notable end results of the Weird Route are that Noelle is becoming stronger and growing closer to Chris. Those would indeed be considered successes if Carol's intention was to make Noelle the second hero of the prophecy, a responsibility that necessitates overcoming cowardice and being prepared to face the end of the world along with her fellow heroes. The reason why the knight and Carol wanted Noelle in the Dark World was to cultivate her strength and grow her into the role the prophecy demands. Believing that's the motivation behind involving Noelle in the conspiracy also brings up an intriguing possibility regarding Chris. LV, love, level of violence. It increases every single time a fountain is sealed, meaning that Chris is getting stronger with every new fountain sealed. If the knight is opening fountains as a way to grow Noelle's strength, perhaps the same can be said for Chris. What we're seeing in DELTARUNE isn't the essence of the knight's plan. It's rather just laying the groundwork for the true plan, getting Chris, and in Carol's ideal world, Noelle, ready for what comes next. That just leaves one question remaining. Who is the third Lightbringer? Who is the conspiracy's intended third hero? If they truly want to bring this prophecy to fruition, they need all three, correct? Who is their Prince of the Dark? Seems difficult to imagine the third hero being anyone other than Ralsei. He is under the assumption that he was molded from clay to be the third hero. He's one of the only characters in the game to fit the description of Prince, alone in deepest dark, and is explicitly called variations of Dark Prince and Lonely Prince throughout the game. The third hero, as depicted in Chapter 4, wears the cloak that Ralsei wore to open Chapter 1, and uses fire magic as Ralsei has been proven to possess. Yet, the fact that Ralsei matches the prophecy so closely, almost paradoxically, creates the perfect conditions for there to be another candidate, because there is someone who Ralsei has invited comparisons to since the very moment his name was first uttered. Someone who is almost identical to Ralsei in multiple different ways, to the point where it takes a trained eye to spot the differences between them. There's an enemy in Deltarune called the Ribic, a rather unassuming enemy without any apparent relevance, window dressing. Yet dialogue, discoverable through their encounters, has proven compelling to the community, especially compelling to me. It tells a tale of two, a messy and unfocused girl, a rowdy and dirty girl, and a poorly trimmed boy, a quiet and smelly boy. Such descriptors fit two characters in Deltarune remarkably well. The unfocused, rowdy, dirty girl, maybe the reindeer with the messy room, the scream metal band, and an attitude anyone with sense would find lovably exasperating. The quiet and smelly boy, maybe the shy and nerdy goat who grew up close to Des, who smoked weed with her and had his sweatshirt stolen by her, who stunk of pizza-flavored body spray. A lost and lost and lost girl, the Ribic continues. A crying and crying and crying boy. The worst word in the English language is goodbye. It's why everyone's so reluctant to say it in our world and in Deltarune's. It's why Des's loved ones refuse to say goodbye to her, to accept she's gone. But such a refusal won't bring her back, or bring back everything she took with her. Someone like Asriel, who it can be assumed loved Des dearly, can't have been complete after her disappearance. Toriel assumes he's having a ball up at college, with new friends, late nights, so much excitement he's forgotten all about hometown and its residents. She's worried, in fact, he won't enjoy coming home. I think she's wrong. I think he spends every day up there, crushed by a loneliness worse than loneliness, an emptiness worse than emptiness. But I think, in another way, she's right. Because this isn't home. Not anymore. Toriel's right to assume there's nothing left for him here anymore. She's wrong to assume that's a judgment he made willingly. After Des disappeared, his families, broke apart, grew to resent one another. Asgore found himself alone as well, straddled with debt and misery. Toriel found herself turning to new men and bottles of cheap wine, to the extent she wasn't always there in the way her children deserved. Chris disappeared into their shell. The Holidays, who may have loved, cherished Asriel as another son. Rudy fell deathly ill. Carol buried herself in her work and fell into a brutal mindset of grief that drove her to obsess over Noelle, who herself pulled away from everyone else. What would you do if you were crushed by that grief? There's no one answer, not something people can guess if they haven't experienced it, not something people can categorize if they have. It's contradictory, grief is, confusing, so many emotions all at once, while feeling nothing at all. Fleeing off to college is probably as effective a way to respond to it as any. Now, what would you do if you knew there was a chance to make things right, just to find what has been lost, to rebuild what has been broken? The worst word in the English language is goodbye. What if you didn't have to say it? Now, that seems a little easier to answer, doesn't it? Asriel isn't a prince, at least not literally, at least not in Deltarune, though he does possess the title in Undertale. But since Asgore in Deltarune is the Flower King, then it holds that Asriel would still be, in a poetic sense, a prince, the Flower Prince. And alone in deepest dark, would that not describe someone who has lost as much as him, who's now all alone, miles and years separated from all he's ever loved? Caddy's reading of the prophecy also gives the hint that the third hero has horns, which Asriel does. Caddy also imagines the third hero as being cute, and it is literally while this dialogue is playing that Susie can discover a letter from Asriel indicating him and Caddy once had a budding romance. albeit one that never seemed to get off the ground, possibly because Azzy became smitten with Des instead. And consider the fire magic the prince as depicted as possessing. The prophecy appears to depict characters in their Dark World forms, and given how Asgore is prophesied donning his Undertale attire, and Dark World Undyne uses spears in Chapter 3, we can deduce that monsters who originated in Undertale will regain their Undertale magic when entering the Dark World, meaning that were Asriel to enter the Dark World, he would presumably possess the fire magic that he possessed in Undertale. And consider, there's a reason to believe that Asriel has already entered Dark Worlds in the past. Asriel was a part of an adventuring party in his youth that explored all around town, even deep into the woods, perhaps around the bunker where we know a dark fountain resides. It's possible that the adventuring party, including Asriel, had previously encountered the Dark World. This is supported by dialogue from Sham, who mentioned that Lightners had previously explored the Dark World, but had, quote, abandoned them, meaning that Chris and Susie aren't the first Lightners to enter the Dark World, and Sham is later revealed to, in reality, be Asriel's favorite childhood toy, given that Asriel has a drawing of the cat on his desktop wallpaper, meaning that Asriel could have, in the past, brought Sham into the Dark World on one of these adventures and brought the cat to life, making them now able to tell these stories about the Lightners of old. For what it's worth, Noelle may have been too frightened to go into the deepest dark places. She does describe crying out of fear when exploring scary places after all. So if she didn't go, then the trio of Asriel, Des, and Chris were possibly the Lightners who explored Dark Worlds in the past. Within that trio, you have a human, a female monster, and a horned prince. That fits the prophecy to a T. Whether or not that holds any relevance to the plot moving forwards, I cannot tell you, but if Des went missing, and the conspiracy is about recovering her, then the only adjustment that needs to be made in keeping the prophecy true is swapping out Des for her younger sister, a younger sister who Carol is possibly endeavoring to make less scared of the dark, more brave, more heroic. The Lightbringers, the three heroes anointed by Carol and the Knight, are three of the members of that adventuring party from the blissful days of their youth, who are determined to brave this dark, twisted reflection of their own world to find their missing fourth. Asriel is the third Lightbringer. He is Carol and the Knight's chosen third hero. I go back and forth on whether I believe he is in on the plan, as Chris appears to be, or merely being unwittingly guided toward the Dark Worlds until he falls into his role, as Noelle appears to be. But regardless, I believe that Chapter 5 of Deltarune will feature Asriel returning home and taking up the mantle that the conspiracy has prepared for him. The reason why the Dark Worlds have only started opening up in the week leading to Asriel's return home is because him returning home is what will allow the plan to begin. So Chris and Noelle need to be trained in anticipation of that happening. The trigger will finally be pulled when all three heroes, all three Lightbringers, are in the same place, which we are rapidly approaching. I find the wording in Rousey's telling of the prophecy to be notable. In his sequence of events, apocalyptic conditions will occur. The earth will quake and the skies will run black. The worlds will be brought to the brink of destruction. And, quoting him exactly, only then will three heroes appear. Only then. The apocalyptic conditions that Rousey describes are presumably the Roaring, which is described in similar terms as an event which will bring about the end of the world. The events that lead into Chapter 1 aren't at all analogous to that existential tragedy, meaning that presumably the conditions which would allow the three heroes to emerge haven't been met yet. So the fact that the three heroes are now depicted running around, having a ball, sealing fountains together, is suspicious. It casts doubt on the notion that Chris, Susie, and Rousey are the three heroes being depicted in this passage. Consider now the wording of a similar prophecy panel in Chapter 4, which also describes the emergence of the heroes after the Roaring. But lo, on hopes and dreams they send, three heroes at the world's end. There's something missing here that was in Rousey's telling of the story. The adverbial phrase, only then, is missing, and the visual that accompanies this text is more definitively Chris, Susie, and Rousey than the heroes as they are depicted later in the prophecy. Just as a note, I do not consider the visuals that appear when Rousey describes the prophecy to be diegetic, and so I will not be drawing conclusions based on them. What we are left with are two different accounts of heroes appearing at the world's end. Ralsei's account talks about 3 heroes making their initial emergence after the Roaring. This panel talks about 3 heroes who appear to be explicitly the Fun Gang, appearing without the qualification of this being their initial emergence. I believe that these accounts are speaking of 2 different groups. The Roaring, when it occurs, possibly in Chapter 6, will bring together for the first time the Lightbringers, heroes of the prophecy, and bring them face to face with the Fun Gang, heroes of the prophecy. One hole in this interpretation of the narrative is that Chris belongs to both groups. Chris has secretly been on both sides at once since the beginning of the game, but now they'll be forced to make a choice. I believe that they will choose the Lightbringers, their brother and their oldest friend, on a quest to save their childhood idol. They love Susie and Ralsei, but they became friends with them a week ago. The Lightbringers are the people Chris has grown up with. These are the people who were involved in basically all of Chris's happy memories growing up. These are the people who are offering them the opportunity to see Des again, to save her. Potentially, an opportunity to wash the blood, the guilt, off Chris's hands. If you believe Chris was accidentally complicit in Des's disappearance, possible if she got lost in a dark world while they were adventuring in one. This conspiracy has been in motion since long before Susie or Ralsei got involved. Chris can't abandon the Lightbringers now, can't abandon their duty now, no matter how much they may be questioning whether or not that duty is just. So, who will occupy the role of the first hero on the side of the Fun Gang? I believe that it will be the Vessel, which game files indicate was not discarded at the beginning of the game, as the second voice suggested. This panel, which I insist is depicting the Fun Gang at World's End, could potentially be depicting the Vessel instead of Chris, because they share the same silhouette. During this fight, the Vessel will be puppeted by us. The player has been the 4th member of the Fun Gang from the beginning, something emphasized in later chapters, with the Chapter 4 climax only being possible because of our light which shines the way. This sets up the climax to be between 3 pairs of characters who are deeply, personally connected to one another. The first heroes are Chris and us, who have been in simultaneously a symbiotic and parasitic relationship since the beginning of the game. We need each other in some moments and despise each other in others. Now is a time where all left unspoken can finally be brought to a head, where the conflict that's been brewing since the beginning finally boils over. The second heroes are Susie and Noelle, whose relevance to each other is apparent. To see them in conflict with one another would be heartbreaking, yet there are fundamental differences between the two which could be fertile ground for a conflict, but that haven't yet been dwelled on. They're from opposite worlds, Noelle having had a privileged upbringing while Susie had to fight for everything she ever got. Noelle's future is bright. Susie hardly saw a future for herself before the events of the game came around. And most importantly, the loss of Des still profoundly affects Noelle. And once she's caught up to speed on the conspiracy, the love she has for her sister and the desire to see her again may take precedence over the love she has for Susie, as real as it may be, especially when Noelle has, in other ways, also lost her father, her mother, and her best friend in the wake of her disappearance. And the third heroes are Ralsei and Asriel, who are clear analogs to one another, from appearance to name to magic abilities. When Susie mistakes an image on Chris's fridge for Ralsei, the image is specifically of a younger version of Asriel. Yes, they have distinct differences, which Chris points out, but to the extent that they do resemble each other, Ralsei resembles Asriel as he was, and not as he is now. Note how Ralsei is around the same height as Chris, and notably shorter than Susie, while the fact that Asriel's old church clothes fit Susie tells us that Asriel eventually grew to be quite a bit taller. Ralsei resembles the version of Asriel that was going on fun adventures with his girlfriend, her sister, and his sibling back in the day, that was sweet and fun-loving, and not the Asriel that's on the other side of the battlefield, jaded and bitter after all that and more was stripped away from him. Regardless of what you believe Ralsei's origins to be he an object or created from pure darkness or an invention of Gaster, I believe that the similarities he has to Asriel were written into his character because he's meant to reflect the Asriel that was there for people. Meanwhile, the Asriel that doesn't have anyone left to be there for stands before us now. In the beginning, when Gaster contrived to have the second voice interrupt him, he likely did it to set up that this story will be about the conflict between these two ideologies. No one can choose who they are in this world, and your choices matter. He set up that dichotomy because it would be the prevailing theme throughout his story and be personified through the conflict between the Fun Gang and Lightbringers in this climactic battle. The Fun Gang, as depicted in this battle, are representative of the will to defy the prophecy. Ralsei has made it his sworn mission to do so, regardless of what he believes is possible. Susie has never accepted what the prophecy, or anyone or anything else, had in mind for her, and the vessel, who was created from the notion that we can choose who we are in this world, can choose a body and a destiny, makes the third. On the other side, you have a consortium of 3 heroes whose stated mission is to carry out the prophecy and see it through to the end, likely because what would be tragic for the Fun Gang and the audience would be desirable for the Lightbringers. They're both the heroes in their own stories and the villains in ours. I suspect that if the light at the end of the tunnel for the Lightbringers is worth risking the Earth itself over, then it must be something infinitely meaningful to those heroes. Des, I suspect, as she was, as they all grew up with and loved. I suspect that after the Lightbringers are felled, Chris, Noel, and Azriel will be reconciled, and all 6 combatants in this fight will come to an understanding and work towards a common goal, or against a common enemy. That understanding could be that Des is gone, and tearing the world asunder, rather than moving on from her, will only cause greater harm. That understanding could be anything else. What I've presented here today is not an ending. It's something that will occur, if it occurs, in Chapter 5 or 6. I'm leaning towards 6. We still have Chapter 7 to speculate over, and have yet to see even a single, confident guess as to what Deltarune's true ending will be. I have no clue, and will make no further assertions other than this. I love thinking about this game, and telling stories within its world. I hope you do too. Thank you very much.
Here's a bonus thought. I didn't feel confident enough in it to integrate it into the main theory. It's not load-bearing, but it is an observation I've had that I'm interested in sharing. There are quite a few connections between the Shadow Mantle and Azriel. Sham, who I asserted was Azriel's childhood toy, was the original holder of the Shadow Mantle. The Shadow Mantle later turns up inside the Dreamer home Dark World, perhaps indicating that the real-world form of the Shadow Mantle lies within the Dreamer household. The Sword Route minigame, which leads you to unlocking the Shadow Mantle, is played on a weird controller, implied to be the knockoff controller that Azriel used whenever Chris and he played video games together, which now resides under his bed. And also can't go unmentioned that said knockoff controller is pink and gold. If you mod the game to equip the Shadow Mantle onto Noelle, she remarks that it's for somebody taller. This could be Des. After all, Des appears to have had some height on her, if the flashback is any indication, and she has an empty coat hanger in her closet. But Azriel is also implied to be taller, since his old clothes fit Susie, the tallest among the core characters, and he and Des also wear the same size clothes since she has one of his sweaters, so perhaps Azriel is the Shadow Mantle's rightful owner. The reason why I considered going on this diatribe in the first place is because I wanted to posit that the cloak the third hero is wearing in the prophecy could be the Shadow Mantle, and if the Shadow Mantle is Azriel's, then it could be additional evidence for him being the third hero. But that's too circumstantial and quite frankly unsubstantiated, to the point where I felt the entire diatribe would do nothing but derail my eventual conclusion. This theory doesn't explain a lot, it just sort of hand-waves everything about the knight. I think subconsciously I wrote it so that Rudy Knight, my preferred theory, can be slotted in the neatest, but I tried to make it clear that if you believe in Death Knight, then this theory can still be true, at least to a certain extent, since if Des is the knight, she's probably corrupted in some way and in need of cosmic intervention to return to her original form. I also didn't really explain how exactly the final prophecy is supposed to resurrect Des, but I probably couldn't have even if I tried because we have absolutely nothing to go on. Either way, thank you all, and I wish you absolutely nothing but the best. I just had a great idea for a shitpost that's probably coming out next, but after that, who knows?